So I'm a parent of two kiddos. And so in the process, my kiddos have had evaluations. And then I started to think about myself. I'm like, this is not dissimilar to me. And, what does this mean? I think most people think of when they think of ADHD as the inability to focus. But what it is it's the inability or the struggle to focus on things that aren't interesting to you. So if you're
Mhm.
interested in something, you're able to focus. If it's not of interest, it's really painful and hard to focus on it and to engage in it. And so a lot of times then that gets interpreted as laziness, not much ability um, in those areas. And what it is it's just a really struggle of taking the brain and moving it to think about these other pieces.
Are you a busy woman who prioritizes everyone else's health above your own? Do you have questions about your diet, exercise, or how to prevent or treat certain health conditions? Are you always Googling health questions that you forget to ask or are embarrassed to ask your primary care physician? Girl, do you even have a primary care physician? Well, welcome to Headed to Healthier. I'm Dr. Brittany Anderson, a board-certified family medicine physician, and every day in my private practice, I have discussions with women just like you who are doing their best to juggle the demands of life while also desiring to become healthier. Inside this podcast, you'll find practical and actionable health tips that you can incorporate into your daily life. You'll get expert advice and insight from some of my awesome healthcare colleagues, and you'll hear relatable conversations with incredible women just like you who have made their health a priority and are thriving because of it. So throw on your sneakers and get some steps in while you listen. Or if you're driving, get those hands at 10 and 2 and let's dig in. We are headed to healthier. Hello, ladies. Welcome back to today's show. I'm so excited for today's episode. We are joined today by Dr. Joy Eberhardt, a pediatrician out of Nova Scotia. And you are now in Nova Scotia. Is that right, Joy? But that is not home for you by a long shot, right? Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, so for me, I have been a little bit of a global nomad and I grew up between the US and Mexico. So I lived in Oregon for about a decade and a half. And so that has been home. And now I would say, yeah, Nova Scotia is home. I did my training in Chicago. So it's somewhat like the weather in Chicago, colder, more snow, but it's right by the ocean, which is beautiful. I
Can't beat that.
absolutely love that. But we don't have the warmth of Alabama. And I
That
have to
is
say,
right.
like,
I think no one has the warmth of Alabama. Sometimes that's a problem.
but yeah, I was just gonna say between growing up in the tropics and then in Arizona in the desert there, I miss the warmth. So bring it on.
Absolutely. Well, we've got plenty of it here in Alabama, that's for sure. So, you are a pediatrician by training, and as I understand it, you now have much of a focus on developmental and behavioral pediatrics. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So I actually was so close to going into psychiatry and I found the field
Okay.
development behavioral pediatrics. And so I switched my
Yeah.
applications and yeah, so then now I do specifically development behavioral. I love what I do. I have my private practice Orchid Pediatrics and yeah, I see the most amazing kids and support them for their well-being. And my slogan is root cause, parent-led, PDA affirming, or you could say neurodiverse affirming.
Awesome. That sounds like a wonderful practice. Well, I'm very excited about today's topic. Today, we are going to talk a good bit about ADHD in adulthood. As a family physician, I see a good bit of ADHD in my clinic. I see it specifically in children and make the diagnosis in children, but we are certainly seeing ADHD in adults. Sometimes it's misdiagnosed, sometimes it's underdiagnosed. But in our audience of women in particular, as that is what most of our listeners are female, I wanted us to talk a little bit today about dealing with ADHD when we have very busy lives. Now, you have a diagnosis of ADHD, as I understand, and you are free to talk with us about that. But you actually identify with another term, and that term is all DHDer. So, can you define that for us a little bit, and then let's get into our discussion for today?
Yeah, so if I get a little too technical, pull me back out.
No, no, it's a new
So
term for me. So please go all into it. I'm sure it'll be a new term for our listeners too.
So ADHD is a combination of autism and ADHD. And in the past, the thought would be is those were two separate diagnoses. They couldn't overlap. But now the understanding is yes, they can overlap. And so for me, yes, ADHD, but also autism and how that interplays, I think is a big piece of how I live life and how I've always lived life. And now I'm finally understanding myself more.
And I'm certain that that also helps you to understand your patients better as well, especially your young patients. I know you mentioned that your practice certainly deals a lot with developmental pediatrics, but that you really cater to families who have neurodivergent children and really help them through that
Mm.
process of kind of understanding their diagnoses and making sure that they have the absolute best care that they need.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think one of my favorite things is helping a family navigate a new diagnosis and then, if a child is diagnosed as autistic, then talking with the family what this means, and then also talking with the child as well. And then sometimes I'll say, "Do you want?" or ADHD, and I said sometimes I'm like, "Do you want perspective of a doctor or a person?" And so
Right.
sometimes I
Yeah.
will I will share those different pieces. So yeah, I love
Absolutely.
it. It's good work.
Absolutely. Well, today, for the purpose of this episode, we want your perspective both as a physician and as a person with that diagnosis. And so let's push into it a little bit. I wondered if you could talk to me and just to our listeners a little bit about your personal journey with ADHD and specifically how it impacts your adult life.
So what I would say is that I think it depends on so many different pieces. I am someone that I've also would identify as twice exceptional. And so someone that has like I just think so quickly, I process so quickly. And I think without knowing it, I've done what I would say is a lot of scaffolding in my life, a lot of creating steps for myself that I think other people wouldn't, but
Yeah.
I just did it so naturally that for me, it wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't really a difficulty until I started my own
Yeah.
business.
Oh,
So I was able to navigate many different pieces. And I think what happens a lot of times with twice exceptional people, so those that you could learn really quickly, but also ADHD is you get to a point where you like your disability, your difference shows. And for some people, many times it's if you are navigating multiple aspects, right? So having kids is a common time, getting onto, graduate studies. Whenever there are more pressures along the way can make it a lot more difficult. And then that scaffolding, those steps that you've done, you have to do it all the more, and then you just can't keep up.
right, right, absolutely. And we can certainly see that. What are some of the key ways that you have found for yourself to kind of rein that in a little bit and be able to get things done when you need to or as you need to, leading a very busy life? I know again that you are managing your busy practice, being a parent. So how do you find or what works best for you to stay on track?
So I like pairing something that's interesting with something that's not interesting. I
Okay,
find that
that's
really
yeah.
helpful. So, so an example for me, and I know you're not all be able to see it, but I like fun visuals. So sometimes I'll have like a fun visual for myself if I have to do something boring. And then that helps me stay engaged a little bit more. I absolutely love colors and pens. And again, I know this is just audio, but I just like
Yeah.
fun colors and it just are so helpful for me.
Yeah, I love that idea of pairing something that is still a little bit stimulating to you when you're having to do things that are perhaps, monotonous otherwise.
Yep, exactly. And so much of adulting, right? It's so repetitive.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. So much of adulting is repetitive. You're so right. So I know as part of your practice that you do make diagnoses of ADHD. Can you talk to us a little bit about that diagnostic process, specifically what that is like for ADHD? And you can talk about it from a pediatric perspective, but also I'd love if you could maybe key in a little bit to the adult diagnosis as well.
one thing I always like to start out with is that whenever we look at diagnoses or diagnostic criteria, is like, where does it come from? And you
Hmm.
just have to call out what was it based out of. So it was based off of white males, and that is what's been geared towards this is the baseline. So if you are not you don't fit those categories, many times that criteria, those like the forms and everything don't quite fit you. So I always have to keep that
Yeah.
in mind when I'm looking at that for kids and families, but the same fits for adults as well. And for an example, what I will do is if I'll see, let's say, a girl, like a teen, and they don't get enough of the twos, right? But lots of ones, then I'll look at what's the narrative, what's the qualitative understanding, what's the experience of the child, and I think, or the I guess in the adults in this standpoint,
Hmm.
and how that affects their life. And I think that can be really important when we look at the forms or the criteria isn't really geared toward the person that's looking for a diagnosis. So like in this case, it sounds like a lot of your listeners are women. And so it's not geared towards them.
Right. And I feel like that's so many things in medicine. Dr. Eberhardt, don't you think that they, especially things that come as forms and other means of diagnoses, that they were based on a specific population of people. And so many times we then try to expand that to fit the person in front of us. And, we've got to get a little bit away from that in practice, right? And really make sure that we're looking at that person right in front of us and making an appropriate diagnosis based on that person specifically.
Mhm.
Yep,
Yes, yeah,
absolutely.
definitely.
Yeah.
I agree.
Share with us what you have found within yourself and what you see in your patient population, some of the misconceptions about ADHD, maybe specifically though when it comes to adults. So what are some things that, someone without a diagnosis of ADHD may just generalize when it comes to that diagnosis? The thing that I think of is say that someone's got a busy day or they get just a little bit scattered or aren't able to focus and they say, oh, that's just my ADHD. And that's not what it is, right? That may be just that they literally are just busy in that day or have a
Mhm.
lot going on. I think of that very commonly because I hear it so commonly.
Yeah, and I think that the concept is there, right? And I think most people think of when they think of ADHD as the inability to focus, but what it is it's the inability or the struggle to focus on things that aren't interesting to you. So if you're
Mhm.
interested in something, you're able to focus. If it's not of interest, it's really painful and hard to focus on it and to engage in it. And so a lot of times then that gets interpreted as laziness, not much ability in those areas. And what it is it's just a really struggle of taking the brain and moving it to think about these other pieces that I mean many times are boring, right? Or it's hard to start, and it's like hard to begin something. And I guess I'll jump to I think that's the other piece too, like taking the smallest possible step to begin something versus thinking about the full task at hand can really help with initiating those boring pieces, those things that just are not grabbing your attention as an ADHDer.
What would you say are some of the key signs of ADHD in adulthood that busy women may overlook? They may attribute it to stress or heavy workload or other factors. What are some of those key signs that adults may see, particularly women?
I think there can be a lot of anxiety and depression, a
Okay.
lot of perfectionism that can come out in it. And the thing that I found for myself is that for most of my life, I dealt with a lot of anxiety. And then when I got that supported and treated, then my my ADHD started to bloom and more. So looking at those different aspects and realizing too that it's not like, we think about those like really hyper kids jumping and bouncing around. It's not that. It's usually more getting distracted. Maybe it's starting an activity, starting a hobby, moving on before you're completing it. Lots of beginnings and very few endings.
Oh, I like that. I think that's a really good way to think of it. Lots of beginnings and few endings. So just that inability, we'll call it inability to get through a task, to complete a task that we start. Okay.
Mhm.
You've already talked a little bit about how this works for you. You mentioned using, pens of different colors, having something that catches your attention or something that is moving, that's around you to be able to look at and draw your attention to when you're having to otherwise focus on something in front of you that is not as exciting to you or maybe a little bit boring to you. For busy women who are juggling, work and family and other responsibilities, what are some practical strategies that you could give to them? And these may be other things that you use when you're dealing with practice and family and kids and busy schedules and
Mhm.
those types of things. What are things outside of medicine? Because we'll talk about that just briefly moving on, but other things that women can do to help manage their ADHD symptoms.
I think having gentleness with yourself can be really helpful. I think what happens a lot of times with ADHD is there's a lot of self-criticism, and so that can become really difficult if you're not able to do what others do easily. And so I think starting there is a really important point. And then from there, letting go of what you can. And then if something is, you have to be able to do it, either find someone else to do it for you or have a way to make it so that you can complete it. An example, I did a leadership course and they talked about how, we all have different strengths and
Mhm.
struggles, and
Mhm.
let's focus on our strengths and hone on that. I am not a bookkeeper, so like for me to look at spreadsheets and bookkeeping is anti me. And so let me have a bookkeeper come.
Right.
They'll do much better and they'll be able to complete it. Whereas me, I'll look at statements and then I'll just get frustrated. But give me the ideas, give me the concepts, and I thrive there. So yeah, really, for ADHDers especially, finding what you love and what you're able to thrive in and creating an environment that allows you to flourish.
Right. And so I love that idea of just kind of outsourcing the things that you can, right? When that comes to family and work, sometimes that's not something that we're able to do, but other things, finding someone to do those things for you. And even when it does come to family and work, making sure that we're appropriately delegating tasks in the workplace and at home as well. So I love that advice. Tell me about time management, specifically how that works for you. Do you find that as something that is difficult for you to manage your time as you go through the day? Or is that something that we should commonly think of that we possibly would see in adults, particularly women with ADHD?
Yeah, so I'll be the one to admit that I'm the last person out of the house.
Oh,
So it's embarrassing to say, but that is a struggle of mine. Um, the For time management, I like the idea of stacking activities,
okay.
so I can do things, um, and I don't have to do them as often. I think is helpful for me. I
Tell
think,
me what you mean
and
by
it
that. I like the sound of it. I feel like I may need to adopt this. What?
Yeah, well, and I guess my mind a lot of goes to work, but I think if we want to talk about home, is you could think about, how you stack laundry, and not literally stacking the laundry, but how are you going to like have time where you focus on the laundry and do the laundry, and get that moving forward. I think in my mind, I'm so visual. I start something and getting it moving forward. And then maybe I'll set a timer, like, okay, I started the washing machine, set a timer for an hour and a half, and then go back to check it, make sure then move it to the dryer, all of those pieces. What other things that I do? I really like ordering things to the house. I think that's incredibly helpful. if you can, instead of having to go out. And I think, especially as a parent of neurodiverse kids, you're just dealing with all of those different transitions. And so just minimizing the amount of transitions to get out of the house and go to the store. So that's kind of a favorite of mine. Lots of play. If you can just play into your life, that can make a big difference. The other thing with time management is I have found the remarkable because I write down on little pieces of paper and lose papers all the time. So it's
Ah,
kind of
yes.
like your paper all in one, and that's helpful for me as well,
Oh, I
everywhere.
see. I'm very much posted. I'm looking at my desk right now as we have this discussion,
Mhm.
and I can count probably 17 post-its on this table. And when I walk away from the table, I'm sure that I will knock three of them off the table and then they will be lost forever.
Right.
So, yeah, I love the idea of that. And I love a good planner. Do you find yourself using a planner or does that just not work for you in your day? I love a good planner.
Yeah, I like it until I don't. And then so I try to find interesting planners.
Uh-huh.
There's a happiness planner that I like, and it has different art. And so
Yeah.
I try to be really mindful of what planners I use. But then sometimes it can get overwhelming.
And so we talked earlier about, treatment options, and we don't have to get into any specific names of medications or anything like that, though I know that you are very well versed in them. But would you talk about outside of medicine, other treatment options for people with the diagnosis of ADHD, whether that, is lifestyle modifications or therapy options? And what other ideas do you have of options that are available?
It's interesting you should ask that. So, I mean, when I think about it, is I think about movement, exercise, nature, getting outside. I think those pieces are just incredibly helpful, taking care of your physical health. Um, a lot of times when we think about ADHD, we think, oh, it's the brain. Really, our mental health, our physical health are so intertwined. And I
Mhm.
actually start to think about, we talk about neurotypes. I think we should talk about body types
Yeah.
because it's really interesting. And I guess this is when I do my doctoring, but with neurodiversity, with ADHD, ADHD, there's a lot of hypermobility. So there's a lot of looser connective tissue, looser joints, more sensitivities to the environment. And so just really being aware of that and how that affects. But I think for someone to really not only understand how they think, but how their body works and how they move in the world, I think is really, really important.
Absolutely. And so I love that as just a way to even begin to think about some of the lifestyle modifications that women can make in addition to medication options. I love the idea of thinking about therapy. You mentioned earlier kind of this intersection of mind and body, and also these feelings of anxiety or depression that may come along with ADHD as well. And sometimes you miss one on account of the other, or you think you've got a diagnosis of one and maybe both are there, or maybe it's the other. So that is something that I sometimes will talk to my adult patients about too, just as an option for them. Again, even with a diagnosis of ADHD, just finding a little bit of help to manage all of those feelings, emotions that may come with it.
Counseling therapy, yeah, I think that can be really helpful as well. Yeah, definitely. So,
So I did not ask about time of your diagnosis, and you don't have to divulge that if you don't want to, but we very often see, especially in women, I feel like a later diagnosis. And sometimes at the time of that diagnosis, a patient will be able to look back and say, you know what, I know for certain that this diagnosis was probably also there when I was in fifth grade, or that it was there through med school. I've got colleagues who say, gosh, if I'd had this diagnosis, second year of medical school and could have been appropriately treated, maybe I would not have had such a hard time with it. And so, do you have any thoughts about that, just in general, people being diagnosed later in adulthood, women in particular, who may have been masking it their
mm.
entire childhood, or who may not have been masking it, but just didn't get the right diagnosis?
Yeah, so that was definitely me, late diagnosis, and I think not dissimilar is that many parents I see, kids get diagnosed and then they start looking into them for themselves. So I'm a parent of two kiddos, and so in the process, my kiddos have had evaluations, and then I started to think about myself. I'm like, huh. this is not dissimilar to me. And, what does this mean? I mean, usually learning was so easy for me. I would usually get bored. So like, when I think about fifth grade, it's not like it wasn't ever really hard, except sometimes maybe like the academics wasn't, right? But other aspects, could be the environment, the social, all of those pieces. So, looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that it definitely makes sense. It definitely would have made my life easier,
Yeah.
myself, understanding myself and just not having such angst about like why is life hard and I don't understand why it is, even though I can do so many things so easily. And I think, what I tell many families, and this doesn't probably apply to everyone, but I feel like this would apply to a lot of your listeners, is that what's easy for them is hard for other people, and what's hard for them is easy for other people. And I think that's just why it made me understand myself like, oh, that's why these things that for other people were so easy were hard for me. And so it would have been, yeah, it would have definitely been helpful to know sooner. And then maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So,
Absolutely. I think so. And I love that story that you gave. I think that may be a point when many women start to realize it or recognize it when they are going through the forms or the checklist or filling out a
mhm,
Vanderbilt scale for their child. And as they're thinking through it, they're thinking, oh my goodness, this was me in fourth grade and this is me right now, as well. But then, they may have not been diagnosed previously, but again learn to kind of either mask it or just to push through it, right? But one of the things that I want to help encourage women with throughout this podcast is to learn to be advocates for ourselves, right? And advocates in our health. What thoughts do you have towards that with just thinking about ADHD and women who, may truly have a diagnosis, but may think, I can continue to push through this, or I don't, need to have a
mhm.
formal diagnosis. Any thoughts there, just as we again start to advocate more for ourselves?
Well, so what I hear, and I'm not in menopause yet,
Mhm.
but what I hear is that once you hit menopause, is that ADHD becomes more difficult. And so I think recognizing different stages of life and how things can become more difficult depending on where you are, but depending on your hormones, all of these pieces, where you are on your menstrual cycle, right? I think that can be a place. When you're used to pushing through, you don't know that life can be easier. And I have to say, I have, stimulants have worked for my kids, and then I was like, it's worked for them. I can try it for myself. And it's the difference between trying to move through. I'm going to use this analogy because I'm, with snow, but like banks of snow where you're trying to walk through like that it's feet deep and just trying to walk through the snow versus just to get out of the snow and walk down the
Yeah,
sidewalk. Like
yeah.
that's like for me the
So that is
difference with
night and day,
medication.
right? That's what I take from that
Right?
analogy. That is night and
Yeah.
day difference.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're strong enough, you're determined enough, you can walk through that snow, but it is, and I guess I want to swear, but I won't. It's a lot easier to not walk through the snow, or you could use the analogy of water, having to walk through water that's waist deep, and just like whereas other people are on dry land and walking, like that difference. And with being trained as an MD conventional medicine, I am biased, but you know, medications are so helpful. And so I think for me that difference, I mean that visual is how I would describe the difference of taking medications and not, and the ability to move in the world.
Absolutely. I love that analogy. Both those analogies that you gave, I think that's important. I may actually steal that for some of my adults, including
Go
I think
for it,
that's great.
do.
Yeah. So that, really kind of focused on those who may have the diagnoses truly there, but have not been formally diagnosed. As we close, would you give me just I mean, you certainly are super, high functioning in your practice. You're a physician, you're doing all these wonderful things, you're managing your family, all these great things. And I believe that you do serve as a source of encouragement for all women. But if I were to ask you to give just a closing message of hope or encouragement for women who are busy but struggling with their ADHD, what
Mhm.
words would you give to those women?
what I would say is life can be really hard sometimes, and you're not alone. You're not the only one, and um, and there are people out there that can offer you support, and in life can get easier. So that's really what I would say is keep hope. And those people, like I guess like me, which I don't have it all together, seem like we have it all together. We don't.
Right.
We're
You're
still
very
learning
right
and
about that.
and stumbling and yeah, and messing up and struggling. But life can be easier. And I just really, yeah, encourage whoever's listening, if you're feeling overwhelmed and discouraged, know you're not alone and know there's supports out there and people care about you.
Thank you for that. Dr. Eberhardt, it has been wonderful to have you join me today. I've really enjoyed our time together. I know that I have some links from you. Will you tell me a little bit about those links? I want to put them in the show notes, but just in case listeners perhaps are in Nova Scotia and want to find you, or just other things that you have going on. I know you've got some great other projects going on too. Will you tell us a little bit about those?
So I work as a physician both in the US and Canada and Orchid Pediatrics. So in the US, it's orchidpediatrics.com, and in Canada, it's orchidpediatrics.ca. I also, and this would be another talk, I identify as the PDA doc.
Yes, that is what I
So
want to
on
talk about. And it can be
Instagram,
another talk, but let's get just a little bit. Give us a snippet of that.
yes. So, PDA, so it's not public displays of affection, or for those of us in medicine, patent ductus arteriosus,
Right.
but stands for
Those were the first
pathological,
and second thing that came to my mind for sure.
right? You gotta
In
love
that
your
order.
homework. So pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy, and it's thought to be a subset of autism, possibly of ADHD, and usually it's people with just really underlying high anxiety as well. And whenever when someone asks you to do something, your answer is no, just as kind of a reflex. So
Which is the opposite
that's
of me. And that's my life problem. That when someone asks me to do something, I say yes. And that is my reflex. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, but me, yeah. So I have to say no in my mind, and then I may say yes. But isn't it interesting, like how all of us, like how our bodies, brains,
Yes.
like they just work differently, how we are in the world. I just find it so fascinating. And then the other thing is supporting parents is just really important to me. Having accessible care is important, and so because I to see me is expensive. I really want to have a parenting group where, parents can come, have community and have access to learning. So I love doing online courses and trainings. The parenting group is part of what I'm promoting Thrive with Dr. Joy. And so it's the PDA Parenting Circle. And I'd love to have you, Dr. Anderson, when I get my podcast going with Thrive with Dr.
Absolutely.
Joy. And so
Absolutely.
we
I
can
love
talk
it.
about
And
more
you'll have to
there.
let me know when that happens, and I'll go back and plug it in the show notes for
Okay.
today's show too. But I love that. Thrive with Dr. Joy. It is going to be awesome. Well, good. Well, I will link all of those things in the show notes for
Thank
sure.
you.
Again, thank you so much. I am so thankful again to you for taking time to join me today. I wish you the best in everything that you do. Again, for my listeners, if you will, check out the links in the show notes of ways that you can find and connect with Dr. Joy Eberhardt. She is doing wonderful things. So, again, Dr. Eberhardt, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening in today. I hope something you heard in this episode will help you on your journey to becoming healthier. Remember, this podcast offers general health information. I am not your personal physician. If you need advice that is specific to you, be sure to consult your physician. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider sharing it with a friend and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts. Also, be sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. Tune in next week for another great episode of Headed to Healthier. Until then, take care of yourself. Talk soon. Bye.